How many of you guys have actually built or worked on CG environments? Okay. And any animators in the room? Cool. Just wanted to get a sense of, where everybody's been and what your interests are. Just so I can try to tailor a little bit, some of, environments are a really big thing. I could talk for 10 hours about environments, but I want to try to make it, something that is digestible to you in an hour and useful to you. So, okay. What is a digital environment? Can anyone define that? Somebody give a go. You. Yeah.
I want to say how it's going to look at the end, and we create the environment in which is like a sandbox on how we make this.
I guess if you're looking at in a pipeline workflow, that's a digital environment. Okay, and now my question is going to get a little bit more focused or not necessarily a question. I guess my statement is that how I'm going to discuss environments is everything that's not an actor, a character or a prop, something that moves around, but instead something that is just the set piece, whether it's a video game, whether it's a movie. I guess in a video game you might blow something up and it'll change, but otherwise the things are just a rigid environment. I'm going to shots where the background is not quite real. You guys have all seen that? Okay, I would call that a 2D background, a 2D environment. It's not really there. It's an effect. It's a practical one, but basically, you have a camera, shooting your actor, and then behind you have a projector projecting this fake background. They're not really there. It's pretty clear, pretty straightforward. Now, in video games, there's a lot of 2D backgrounds, and a lot of popular video games still have 2D backgrounds. They're not 3D moving. They might multi-plane, which is like a couple layers of 2D, but there's no perspective change. Some of them are just like other successful ones, really gorgeous backgrounds. I don't know if you guys have ever played Braid, but this is a really fun game, and I love it because it sells a 2D background so well for the whole experience. Matte paintings. For the longest time, when you had to build you couldn't build a set because it's too expensive. You either had to find a way to build it, or you fake it. In a lot of the original Star Wars, people still don't realize that a lot of these were just a painting. Somebody took a paintbrush and went on glass, and they painted all this stuff and composited some stuff behind it. They're like outside of the space. That's the clear area of the glass where they would actually put another layer of effect behind that. But still, it's a 2D environment, a 2D effect. And where that's beneficial, even to this day, is that you can get to a final really quickly on a shot. You can, if you have a talented artist, you can rough out a thumbnail and get an approval on that, and then do a really fine detailed version of that, and it's done. It's great. The 3D environments just have nothing on that. Just I'll move on to let me go back real quick. One of the detriments to this, one of the things that's hard, is, let's say you like it, but then somebody up higher in the studio or somebody with more clout or power says, I don't like that. that means you start from scratch. You have to throw away everything you've done generally and restart from scratch. And that's like a linear increase of time for every iteration. So that's the detriment. 3D environments, okay, I'm going real far back again to Metropolis. It was one of the most influential miniature uses that kind of lent its influence on 2001 Space Odyssey and Star Wars. You know, this is actually a miniature that they would use for this futuristic cityscape. And this is a 1923 film. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it for kind of getting a sense of where a lot of visual effects started. Metropolis. There's a robot that looks like C-3PO. You'll like it. So, proving that's the miniature. So, miniatures were the go-to 3D environment for decades, because and the benefit of miniatures is that you can relight it. You can say, okay, this lighting isn't working, so I can take my lights, move them to a different place, and you can say, oh, now it's a different time of day. You can't do that with a painting. You can't do that with 2D. The other thing is you can have several people working on it at the same time, just like as in this photo, So you can get more people on the same work, whereas painting, it's really hard to have 5 paintbrushes in the same little square. And so that brings its benefit. The other thing is you can look around surfaces, with a camera. Going back to something like this, it's painted, so if you wanted to see the backside of the spaceship, you just can't. You have to paint a new painting. So Tron, when it hit in 1982, it kind of revolutionized the method of the 3D shot. It was the first time that you had a scene, a location that wasn't built out of physical matter. It was built out of data and ideas. I like to think of it as, they're dreams that are, just realized as pixels, because they're never built in a physical form. When that came out, it was huge. I mean, it was a new look, and it changed the mindset of a lot of people in visual effects. They could see where it was going, but the Academy, like the Academy Awards, the Oscars, they looked at this as somebody wrote a program that does your work for you, like it does your homework, and they didn't give it any credit, and it wasn't nominated that year because they thought that somebody made a machine that took jobs away from artists. How wrong they are, we'll get back to that, So it's not much to look at, but at the time it was pretty cool. 30 years later, we have the Tron follow-up. It's night and day. You can't even compare how far the technology has come. We've now gotten to a place where the set looks like it could be real. It looks like just as good as a miniature. For 30 years, we were dealing with the CG stink, as we call it, where no matter what you do to the look dev, the shaders, there's just something a little off, something that's just not quite real. You watch the Star Wars prequels, and it still kind of looks like a video game. And that was the industry's best minds working on that. But as a previous speaker mentioned, PBR is changing everything. It's now made materials that behave the way that materials should, and they're predictable between renderers and in almost any look that you do. that's led us to this place where we now have a predictable paradigm of saying, I can spec out a set, and I know it's going to look just as good as a miniature. I know that people, I don't have to worry about people, not believing in the surfaces. And so, I'm sure most, if not all of you, have seen this movie. Anybody not seen this? I would say, I would bet money, if I was a betting man, that this image alone in the movie trailer made you go see this movie. And that's because it messes with your brain so much to see something that looks so real doing something that it shouldn't. And this is what I love about CG environments, is something you can't do with a physical set, and you can tell a story that you just really weren't able to tell before. So the question is, how do you do these? How do you make this giant successful image? I'm going to pick apart this just a little bit in terms of what helped them. One thing that you don't notice is that all these buildings are essentially the same building. So they built one piece of geometry, and then they cloned it a bunch of times in a process known as instancing. Do you guys all know what instancing is? And who doesn't know what instancing is? And I'll talk about it. Okay, there's a couple. It's one of the difficult things about environments is that they're so rich, they're so detailed, that you need to fit this stuff into your system memory, your RAM. And it's easy to run out of RAM when you have detailed geometry. There's all sorts of ways to try to cheat that by saying, okay, well, those objects in the back, I'm going to turn down their polygon count, things like that. But oftentimes that requires more work than it's worth and creates artifacts, such as if you're trying to do that by a distance from camera, things will cross that threshold and pop, like polygons will just change, and nobody wants that. And so instancing is, I think, one of the fundamental things. If you're going to be working on environments, you have to realize some of the nuances of instancing. What you can do with instancing is take, say you take this building here and you clone it. It doesn't use up any more memory than, typically if you had two of those buildings and each one was, let's just say a gigabyte of memory. If you had two of them, that'd be 2 gigabytes. You're going to quickly run out of memory as you build a city. But if you instance it, then pretty much it doesn't really increase your memory. It's like 4 kilobytes or something like that to just write a definition in the renderer. But what a lot of people don't realize is that you can also assign different materials to an instance of an object. So it can look like a completely different thing. And that's, I'll get to that in just a second. But it's going into environments, you just have to know that it's so much work. It's going to be risky and it's going to be expensive. And I'm going to outline a lot of the problems that I've run into over the years, so that when you're in that situation, hopefully that maybe some of these things you'll remember. Hey, John said this or that, and maybe we should look into something. Forgive me. But to do it well, to make a believable looked at, you have to start with a good model and then good textures and then good surfaces, and that takes time. Now, if you just want to recreate this room that we're in, you look around and you see that there's just a ton of stuff, and I think in your mind's eye, if you took a picture of this, you wouldn't actually think that's that much stuff. But when you're making a shot, filling it with enough items becomes one of the biggest challenges. And each item has to look real. It has to fit a certain standard, or at least you have to know which items can and can't fit that standard. The tiles on the wall here, you could say this is a tileable texture map, but pretty soon your brain subconsciously will know where that becomes a tileable texture map. It looks too homogeneous, and starting to create variation is one of the important things. So one of the things, I guess you had a good question on the last round about where to start with shaders. I'm more of an artist. I'm not anywhere as smart as that guy. But I've run into some of those same questions. And so, he was showing some stuff on OSL, shading language. It's a really cool way to start getting into shaders. When I got into shaders, it was all text files, and you'd learn all the commands for a shading language and write them out as text. That's getting harder and harder to do because shaders are getting more and more complex. But what's new is that a lot of renderers have broken open the architecture for the shading language so that you can actually access a lot of things that you couldn't before. You could, access like your world position, your object space position, and do really cool things. Like one thing I would suggest, if you're really interested in that, is getting into, don't look at it as I want to generate my own like ray trace BSDF or whatever like that. I would say get into making your own textures procedurally, and there's a lot of things to learn about that, and a lot of things that are at your fingertips. For instance, a lot of houses for environments, naturalistic environments like cliffs and caves, stuff like that, they'll use triplanar texturing. Do you guys know what that is? It's have you set up a texture projection before, where like you set up like a planar projection on like a sphere and it just projects that brick pattern? Okay, what you can do is make a shader that has 3 of those, like left, top, and front. And you can make a shader that blends nicely between those. And if you have good tileable textures, what ends up happening is like your projection, because you define your planar projection in a world space unit, it just tiles till the end of the universe. So if you have a good tileable texture, you can make something that just it creates variation depending on the surface. If you have a surface that has a lot of variation in it, you'll get different textures based off of the angles, and it won't quite look as tiled, as patterned. And so that's a really good starting place. Triplanars. Looking at bombing, there's bombing is a technique. I just researched that. I can't totally go into it right now, but it's where you're creating like stamps of a texture based on its position in world space, and there are a lot of ways to do that using like cell noise and stuff like that to isolate attributes. If you've seen cell noise that you've put onto an object before, you can actually use that to change the seed of your Perlin or whatever noise function, and so you can get a lot of cool variation off of that. And playing with several octaves of texture mapping or noise is really important for large scale geometry, because sometimes when you're doing terrain, you're going to get really close to like the dirt, the ground, but that's going to be the same geometry as something that's like a kilometer away. And you need to find a way to procedurally texture it so that it looks good to you up close, but also far away. And those are kinds of things that procedural texturing methods will allow you a lot of cheats, because I guarantee you're going to run into a lot of situations where somebody's going to be presented a large piece of geometry, and they're going to start with, well, what size resolution map do we need for this? 8K. And 8K is never enough. You know, you're never going to have enough for a large texture. I mean, try to imagine taking any megapixel photo and blowing it up to, you know, 50 meters, and you're going to see pixels. So getting comfortable with procedurals and tiling is key for large scale environments. Now, so I was talking about, you know, there's a lot of things in this room that you have to be conscious of if you were going to try to recreate this room. But outside of this room, or even in this room, and, you know, if you just took a look out of the window at a city, or you went even a little further and you went out into the nature, it's not just quantity. You know, you could say, I'm going to take, you know, 5 variations of a palm tree and scatter them everywhere, or even more. But the relationship between those things is where things get really tricky. As a manager, you have a lot of these environment shots to do, and so you go, how many people do I have? I'm just going to assign people to these shots, and you have to be really smart about who you're assigning to layout of an environment, because they have to be making aesthetic decisions all the time, and not just something that you go off of a list and say, oh, okay, we're going to put trees over here, and we're going to put, you know, rocks over here. This is where, you know, artistry really comes in. And in the digital entertainment industry, there's a lot of talk where people say, you know, oh, you're not an artist, you're more of a technician, somebody gives you an assignment and you do it. And don't listen to them, it's BS, because artistry is what makes you excel. You know, the people who excel in this industry are the people who are consistently making decisions, artistic decisions, and when it comes to environments, you have to. I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen people create a scene and there's no attention paid to rule of thirds, you know, and that's just basic composition of a frame. I guarantee if you're gonna lay out environments, you're gonna forget that, what I just said, you know, and you're gonna go, why is this not looking right, or why is this not looking good? There's so many things that go into what make a single frame look good, and it's gonna take years and years to get good at it, you know. As a side, just draw, pencil and paper. Don't, you know, if you're going into environments, you have to draw, because you have to stay very connected to the 2D frame and forget about the relationships of things in 3D space. So, again, things like a city, when you're looking at laying out a city, your first impulse is like, wow, that's a lot of work. I need to find a city generator, you know? And so everybody's got this, you know, comment, hey, why don't you try that city generator, you know? And if you ever really look at any of them, and it's the same with forest generators, they're like frozen food at the market, you know? It's like, yeah, that's food, but it's never really good food, you know? And that's because every shot needs decisions. It needs somebody to say, I'm going to make this the hero building of this shot, and I'm, you know, you can never procedurally make a foundation for environments. You have to use procedurals to disguise your cheats, like throwing a 3D noise across lots of instances to make them look like different things, or you may be able to use 3D noise to vary positions, but you have to of like trees, but you have to define where those trees go initially. And these are just kind of like procedural workflow things that I'm sure maybe you'll gloss over some of this until you actually get to the point where you have to lay out big environments. And like I said, you know, this is an environment look dev talk, but anybody who does environment look dev will soon know that environment layout and look dev are the same thing. You're gonna have to get in there and plant trees and put things there as a look dev Now, there's a lot of things that are going to make it really hard to do environments, and I don't try to say that to like scare people off. I say that because that's what makes environments fun. That's what makes it interesting. When you get in there and you like start addressing some of these problems and trying to find solutions, that's like the cool science. We're like, we still don't know exactly how gravity works or what a photon is, things like that. And those are those like fundamental things. Like when somebody solves those, it's going to be amazing. And if you solve some of these problems with, environments being difficult, you're going to have a business model. You're going to be able to use that, whatever company, to do better than the next company. And, I've been in this industry for 20 years, basically, entertainment industry. But at Rhythm and Hues, I was there for 16 years, and I've seen so many paradigms come and go, and so will you, and you're going to be lucky if you're part of some of those changes. And I say try to take on the hard problems that I'm talking about. Now, some of the cool things that are coming about are libraries. You're soon, like we were talking about with PBR shaders, they're all starting to become the same in every platform. And so it's not here yet, but give it a year. You might be part of this change. You're going to have like libraries of props or characters or things like that are just usable. Just 5 years ago, you build a look dev. 1 year later, it doesn't work anymore because the shader technology has changed, the renderer has changed, the way you lay out UVs and things like that has changed. But now we're starting to find a language in the industry where we have things like UDIMs. Everybody know what UDIMs are? They're a way to lay out UVs on characters that streamline a lot of how you create your maps. So, like we used to make a map for the left arm, a map for the right arm, and the body. But now you can put it all in one large map, like a 4K map. But each one has tiled UV coordinates for which geometry it goes to. And so there's two paradigms right now I see in the industry. There's that, and then there's PTEX. And I think that the UDIMs are going to eventually win out for being the next gen thing. And when that happens, I think having libraries makes it easier for a studio to just buy a bunch of stuff and then somebody can place things. So, given all those, problems, I just, I want to say, when you're looking at what you're going to do for a given environment, so far I've said 2D and 3D, and when 3D just is too expensive for whatever project you're working on, like there's too many people that would be required to hit the goal that we want, or if there were libraries available, but they were too expensive, you can't do that. The third option is 2.5D. Does anybody know what 2.5D means? What's that? Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the important distinction between 2D and 3D. 3D, you can look around an object. 2.5D is taking a 2D matte painting, like that Star Wars thing I had up, and projecting it onto geometry. So, sorry, I can gloss over these. These are just some other things that I've worked on. I put them in here because I thought maybe I'd discuss them. Don't think I need to. It's Hotel Transylvania. It's when you're looking at stylized look dev, you can get away with a lot. You can it gets more about painting frames and things like that. But the Avatar, most people think Avatar was it was all 3D look devs all the way. The whole horizon was CG rendered leaves, but quite a bit of Avatar was matte painted. And so what they would do is they'd make these paintings as Photoshop layers. They'd break out things by depth. Like the further away you get a different Photoshop layer. And what you end up doing is projecting them onto cards or geometry, you know. And when I say cards, I just mean like a flat grid or a plane. And so what that enables you to do is, you know, you have a 3D camera that you can move around and get a little bit of the parallax that we're talking about. And how fancy you want to get with that geometry, it's up to you as an artist, but it's also up to the needs of the shot. So if you have like a rocky terrain or something like that, you can actually paint that and model the rocky terrain to approximate where the boulders are, things like that. And it works really well. So here's an example that a friend of mine sent me of what we're doing quite often in CGI is we'll actually have models that we'll start with that are crude. Sometimes they'll take stuff from Google Earth, or you know, some kind of 3D mapping software as a starting point, and then they'll render that like this, gray shaded, and then they'll just paint on top of it. And they'll have, you know, a starting place to reference, but then you can get somewhere pretty believable like in a couple of days. Whereas if you were to go through and create a look dev for every one of these little like freeways and buildings, it would take you weeks, if not months. So the cheat here is that because you have all those CG objects to start with, you can paint this in several layers and project onto, say, this building here, independently of the projection going onto here. So as the camera moves, you reveal more of this building's Photoshop layer, and you believe it, you buy it. Where this inevitably goes is 2.5D photogrammetry. Does anybody know what photogrammetry is? Okay, this is going to be huge because you've seen examples of this where somebody goes and they take a photograph of an object from a lot of positions, and then they just take those photographs and feed it into a computer, and it generates some geometry. Have you seen that? Well, for the past maybe 10 years, it's been an exciting project for a lot of people. Like, it's it's really cool. I want to do something with that. But now, this past year, it's really made its way into the economy of games. If you look at Star Wars Battlefront, I encourage you, whether or not you're a game fan or a Star Wars fan, to look up Star Wars Battlefront and the way that it looks. There's so many of these like desert scenes that they look pretty convincing for a video game, and that's because they sent a team out all over the world to go shoot in the snow, go shoot in the desert, go shoot in the forests, and recreate these objects just from photos. And that cuts down, a lot of the look dev requirements of saying, like, do I get buy off on this tree or whatnot? 1024, or was it 2410? I think it's 1024, is a site that does scanning, or it's a company that does scanning using this method. And here's an example of it. Let's see if I have to play it. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. You could take something like this, put it into your shot, put it into your video game, whatever you're working on, and it's quite believable. You get geometry that is a good foundation starting point. So what a lot of people do is they'll start with this photogrammetry, they'll bring it into ZBrush, and they'll sculpt it to look a little bit more refined. They'll bring it back into their photogrammetry software and then use all those cameras to reproject onto the new geometry, and they have something that is of really high quality, and you're pretty much limited to your photographs. If you take really good photographs, you can have a really good result. Some of the places this falls apart is when your terrain or whatever you're creating for your environment has like sheen, specularities, things like that, reflections. Just they don't always work out so well, and so this works really well for most things that don't have sharp reflections. But it's a really good place to think of a cheaper way of generating some assets that look really good. You know, it's in some ways it's akin to baking your textures. Do you guys know what that is? Okay, good, because if you're doing CG environments, finding a way to bake your lighting is one of the biggest optimizations. I am gonna pause. I worked on the Jungle Book in pre-production. I guess it was about a year and a half ago, and this really kind of was a new way for me to work with environments, and it was really exciting. And I think that it's the future of these green screen, blue screen movies is that before you go to shoot, before you go to set, you make a video game version of the entire movie. Now, I think Gravity did this, the movie Gravity, and Jungle Book as well. It's James Cameron kind of started this process with Avatar, of having a digital volume soundstage, where you had to build a lot of the assets up front. In Jungle Book, Jon Favreau was all over this process, and Rob Legato was the visual effects supervisor who did Avatar as well. He did this movie, and Digital Domain took a version of Unity game engine, and they made the whole movie using Unity. And they had, I think they actually had the same actor do a bunch of motion capture for example motion to put in there. And they actually got the layout of all the environments in just really cheap trees in the game engine. And then I was working for MPC, Moving Picture Company, and Digital Domain would give us their assets, their environments, and we would flesh them out. We'd take these kind of like garbage tree geometries that were good enough to tell the story, the blocking, and we'd flesh out those trees, and we would light the shots with the cinematographer. He would actually sit with our team and say, okay, this is going to be more moody, let's cut out the sunlight, or we need like God rays poking through in this direction, little pools of light here. And we actually created all of the lighting for the movie before they went to set. And so when we rendered out the lighting, we'd render them as what they called bubbles. These like 360-degree panoramas. And the cinematographer's team and the director, Jon Favreau, could just take their iPads and click the bubble that they wanted to see, and they could just look around their green screen set and see, oh, there's the sun, here's a tree casting a shadow right here, and that enabled them to place all their lights and light the kid, which most of this movie was a green screen movie. And I still don't know if I've seen a better example of that. I worked on another movie that was a total green screen movie after that, and it just, when you don't have that kind of like a synergy of lighting direction on set to what you're going to end up with as your final digital image, it starts to look fake. So I'm just going to play through this just to show in the final result for each of these shots, they're using a lot of the 3D sets, and for the extreme distance, they're using the 2.5D matte painting. And basically that's the approach. If you're going to do a photoreal movie like this, you're going to approach it that way. You're going to do CG up until you can't really discern whether something's, real or not, which is, I look at it as like 50 to 100 meters away, and then after that you can transition to a matte painting for the background, but I'll play this in case any of you haven't seen this. Oop. Did we just die? We died. I'll get us back there.
Because we had decided to use this completely virtual environment approach, we figured it's an opportunity to take the best of the animation process and the best of motion capture and the best of live action. You combine those things, you can do something that nobody's done before.
You could just walk while at everything else, and I was like, but how? That's not possible. But they made it possible.
This is a virtual production workflow. We're trying to leverage the latest technologies that are available to us in lighting, rendering, and interactivity to enable a new set of tools to visualize shots that we would see on a live action set.
What makes us able to make this movie now is the technology to have photoreal and normal animation.
What are you looking at?
Every single shot requires hundreds of people and a tremendous amount of collaboration.
A lot of it is research. You just do a ton of research. That is your basis of reality. And the research is good because it sparks ideas and different ways of looking at it, and you get to kind of live it and you walk through it. It's pretty much starting with the backbone or the basis of real life. The way it moves and looks and scratches its face and the way it reacts to light. The only fantastical thing is at the actual speed.
What do you think they're talking about?
This idea of blending old and new technology, and then to see how they sew it all together. For me, it's magic.
The goal here is for people to not know what's real and what's not real. There's a lot of people, a lot of artists working on this film. There's a lot of technicians. Everybody's been very generous in sharing their techniques and their experiences. It's really been remarkable. Films have to be an emotional experience for the audience. You have to tell a good story. I wanted to hold that standard. If I'm engaged emotionally with the characters, all the spectacle was worth it.
Interesting tidbits from working on that was a comment that Jon Favreau kept saying that I'd never heard from anybody else in any other movie is stop making it look so pretty, and what that meant is like we'd paint these skies that were like these perfect beautiful skies with like the sun peeking through clouds, and what he was noticing was that's not the way a movie looks. If you go and you shoot a movie, the foreground looks, you light for the foreground and the background might just be blown out. The sky might be white because of the way that your camera exposes. And when everything is just too perfectly balanced and everything's too pretty, it takes you out because you start to suspect this isn't the real story, this isn't a real place. And so it's just one of those things that it's good to be conscious of when you're laying out an environment. If you make something too pretty or you expose for the shadows and the highlights, like trees are a big one. If you're outside of a forest of trees and you're looking at the trees, the shadows inside of the trees are going to be black. If you look at a photo of this in real life, you're not going to see in those shadows because your camera has stopped down in order to see the highlights on the leaves. And if you're under the trees and you're seeing all the bounce lighting going on in there, everything outside, the sky is going to be blown out. It's going to be like really white, and you're going to have really hot highlights on some of the leaves in the sunlight. So some more things to be conscious of. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but anybody know? I haven't been tracking, but okay. I just wanted to go over, one more thing that I think is really cool when it's coming into environment layout. Very soon, you can be the person to start this because, there's all of the big houses are trying to figure this out. Unity, Unreal, and CryEngine are all now, I think they're all free to use packages for like laying out stuff. And so one of the coolest things that I've seen, and I think all of these packages are starting to offer it, I think by the end of this year, each package will offer this, is something called like a shared workspace, or a shared work file. So you can have an animator placing their animation inside of the file, because everybody is kind of plugging into the same file at the same time. Let me back up. Have any of you guys used like Google Documents, like a spreadsheet, things like that? If you've ever used spreadsheet and had like multiple people in there at the same time, you see like your one cell is one color, and I'm red and so is blue. Multiple people all over the world can be accessing the same document. This is what's happening with environments. So you can have an animator placing their animation and their character in a scene. You can have a set dresser coming in and placing trees and key objects, and you can have somebody blocking the lighting all at the same time. Now, I'm sure that this is going to cause people to bicker and, get upset at each other, but it's a really good problem to have, because one of the inefficiencies about our current process is one person does an environment, or a rough environment, hands it over to animation, and they try to make it look good, but oh, that tree is in the way. So then they send it back to layout to fix that tree, and then they send it back. There's so much back and forth that we're now at this place, this year or next, where we're no different than working on a soundstage, so that everybody's actually there working together as a team, creating this thing as a team, communicating as a team, because I'm seeing what you're doing as you're doing it, and not wondering when that's going to happen, or so the people who start experimenting with those technologies are going to find their efficiency the fastest. They're going to find that they're going to start merging previs with post-viz, at the same time. I don't know if you guys know those terms. I'm sure you've heard of previs. Previs often happens usually at another company, but companies are starting to do it themselves because if they're able to reuse that animation or that blocking, then it saves more time and money to start with. Post-viz is usually when you shot something and you come back to the studio with the plates, the footage, and then you try to use that somehow to create a first pass of your scene. I'm gonna cut right there and just hope I can get some questions out of you guys. So.
Yeah. Any question from the floor? Yes. The mic is there. Your name and your question, please.
Hello. Hi, my name is Meier. I just want to know what's your advice for a character artist who would want to go into environment?
I'm sorry, a character artist?
Yeah.
That wants to go into environments?
Yeah.
Now, when you say you're a character artist, what do you mean by that? Like a look dev artist?
Someone who does character visualizations and developments, and just more towards character than environments. Yeah, something like that. Character design.
Well, I'd say that you're perfectly suited for environments, because when you're doing character work, you're trying to create something that looks unique and has a persona to it, and you want that, in your objects in your scene as well. It's just most people when they go towards the, like I'm going to make a couch or something like that, they're just crossing off a list. Okay, that looks like the photograph, or some kind of reference. And so if you're able to bring character to all those pieces, that's something that you bring to the table. Now, I don't see any difficulty in you transitioning to environments because, the only thing you might be missing out on is learning some of the layout. I would say start with learning layout, learning instancing, learning how to cheat your instances with procedural shaders to make variations. So, as you're doing character work, sometimes you'll make, like I don't know, like my first thing goes back to working on Life of Pi. We had, on the island, we had these meerkats. And, we had tens of thousands of these meerkats, and you had to make them look different. And so at R&H, we called them flavors, which it's kind of, it's a weird terminology now, but variations is another thing that people use at different houses. But those kinds of things, when you're working with characters, I'm sure you've had to deal with variations. That translates into environments really, really well. If you can further your abilities to use procedural stuff to create variations, that's huge. And I'm going to go back again and be redundant and say draw environments, try to draw landscapes, try to the better you are at just graphite pencil on paper at drawing a landscape, the more amazing you're going to be as an environment artist. At ILM, they have a department called Digimat, and that's kind of one of their ways of doing environments. And what they do is they'll lay out an environment, like they'll push and pull, a terrain, and try to do some procedural displacements and texturing, and place whatever boulders, rocks, whatever, and they'll render that with the best procedurals they'll have, and then they'll take that and either hand that over to a matte painter, or that same person can do the matte painting, and they'll paint over, like that city that I had up here. They'll paint that to look exactly the way they want it to, and reproject it back onto the geometry. Playing with those kind of techniques is something that will also further your profitability for whatever company you work at. If you're able to do that kind of work, you will never have to look for a job, because those kinds of artists are so sought after. They're like, I would say, on the same shelf as effects artists, people who use like Houdini to do particle simulation and stuff like that. They're never out of work, because it requires deep, like, technical skills, but also deep artistic skills. And finding that in an employee is really hard. Usually they skew one towards the other. Sorry if that was a long-winded answer, but...
Okay, all right.
Anybody else?
Any more? Or one last one before we proceed to lunch. Yeah, okay. Your name and we know your name already. Let's proceed to your question.
My name is
How many questions?
One.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, like we see the Jungle Book movie, and my question is it cinematographer need to involve in the VFX department
Yes.
after?
They should be. When you involve the cinematographer in what's considered post, man, it makes such a difference. It makes such a difference. If one of the things, I mean, like with Jungle Book, the cinematographer was directing post before they shot the movie. So it's like post visual effects or pre-production visual effects, it's becoming so blurry if you're doing it right. You don't, right now we have a pre-production budget, we have a production budget, and we have a post-production budget in film. Now that's only because people need that to be that way, because of different groups of people. If they were all in the same family, making the movie, they'd save a lot of money for the whole production in general and make a much better movie. The post-production budget usually goes to a visual effects house like ILM or Weta, and that budget doesn't account for the cinematographer's pay. So they're usually excluded, and it's I think a huge mistake, because when they're shooting, on set, they have a very specific intention in mind for every shot, like how they're building the light, and then they just hand that off to somebody else who doesn't know those answers. And so you look at movies like How to Train Your Dragon. That was a DreamWorks movie where they had Roger Deakins, a really, really good cinematographer, at DreamWorks working with the team. And it was one of the most successful movies ever. So the more that happens, the better the movie's going to be.
So the same cinematographer should be involved.
Should be. That's, in my opinion, it's like saying you have one director for the live action and then you get a different director for the visual effects. It becomes confused, it's too many cooks.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. And of course, a big round of applause for John Meier. Thank you very much, sir.